We've got a report now from the South China Morning Post that, that deputies meeting went so badly, the principals meeting is now going to be shorter. What more do we know?
Yeah, that's right. So the SCMP reporting that the Chinese delegation will be cutting short their visit by one day, essentially that the deputies who have been putting the groundwork in play ahead of the meetings between Liu He and his US counterparts Thursday, Friday in DC, that essentially they'd made no progress. The forced text transfer was not on the table. That wasn't discussed. China refused to discuss that. State subsidies was not discussed either. The only things they talked about, it seems, are agricultural purchases and intellectual property. And crucially, China failed to persuade the US to agree to holding off on those additional tariffs come October the 15th. So it does seem that unless there is a radical change in tone from these two sides and massive progress achieved in the next 12 to 24 hours, it does seem we're looking now at additional tariffs come October the 15th and then again, potentially December the 15th as well.
Sarah, would it be fair to say that nothing much has really changed, at least when it comes to the demands from both sides, since the talks broke down in the spring?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's still were even question marks up until this week, really, where the starting point was for the talks. They did have a text in May that the U.S. described as 90% agreed to, and then, of course, accused China of reneging on those commitments. The U.S. always wanted to go back to the text of that agreement, but of course, China, as we've seen from reporting from even our own sources, has said, it wants to take those big issues like state subsidies and IP theft off the table and go for some low-hanging fruit. So, I think the fact that the mood music is bad going in. We're seeing reports that there isn't much progress being made at the deputy level isn't surprising. That being said, when the principals do meet, there is that chance always for progress. Once they sit at the table face to face, perhaps Trump himself can intervene. They're taking place in Washington, and that's where President Donald Trump will be tomorrow. So we're going to have to see exactly how this plays out. It'll be very interesting to see the statements that they release and if they're able to keep the talks going Thursday and Friday.
Sarah, you mentioned the mood music there heading into these talks. It was pretty dreadful. We had the blacklisting, the travel ban, all sorts of other headlines as well. What was the intent here? It certainly didn't look like the US was trying to set things up for a productive meeting. Absolutely. At least the perception of it was that the U.S. almost seemed to be sending a message to China that they have a lot more leverage than maybe Beijing might have, or they have plenty of sort of tricks up their sleeves, it seems. Of course, I think the Trump administration would say that all of these actions that have taken place, like the visa bans and the blacklisting of Chinese firms, it was sort of a coincidental happening. They have nothing to do with the trade talks, but it's hard to imagine that they take place in isolation.
When it comes to leverage, though, Tom, it seems China has big leverage over the NBA as their fight continues over freedom of speech. What do we know?
Yeah, this whole issue, this whole controversy is added to that acrimony that you've been talking about. Of course, you discussed the blacklisting of the companies, you discussed the travel bans, you discussed the proposals around reducing investment to focus on US investment in Chinese equities, of course. But in terms of the NBA scandal, again, that is just adding to the bitterness between these two sides. So now you've seen essentially the NBA lose all of its sponsorship partners, virtually all of its partners in the Chinese market. You've seen major companies like Tencent and Ctrip and Meng all cutting their ties to the NBA on the back of this scandal over this tweet, of course, by the GM of the Houston Rockets in support of pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. And, of course, the NBA have refused to apologize for that, so they continue to face this backlash. This was meant to have been a major week for the NBA here in China. They had planned to have these exhibition games with the Lakers, the Nets, for example, in Shanghai. There are question marks over whether or not those games are going to go ahead. And, of course, we're going to look at the economic impact for the NBA here. It's their second largest market. They have 800 million fans. But it's not just the NBA that suffers. It's also China, arguably, and its image on the global stage. Because, again, this will be being viewed, and you see this in the Democrats, the Republicans, and others in the US, as, for them at least, another sign of the kind of belligerence that Beijing can stoop to when it tries to get its way on these issues.